the Rugby World Cup's top try scorer.
So Bryan, thank you so much for joining me on this call. As you know, I work for Leo International and we're offering UK investment properties to South Africans. And it's really good to have you joining us because I know we've been speaking a bit and it's something that you have done yourself. And it would just be really interesting to understand the reasons behind that and just to ask you a few questions about the process and how you got to doing that.
Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to it. Hoping I can answer the questions accurately and descriptively enough. Just outright, it is a very scary process, from the outset, and one which you always grapple with. But I think having people, like LOI who make it easier is definitely the way to go, particularly if you just don't have any context or knowledge of it. So looking forward to the chat.
Yeah.
And, hopefully I can answer well enough.
I'm sure you can. Thanks, Bryan. So you are proudly South African and have traveled extensively throughout your career. And I just wondered why you chose UK property as an investment option.
I want to say it was purely by mistake. I was coming towards the end of my career. I was fortunate enough to spend 5.5 years in France, and as incredible as the lifestyle was in the south of France, in Toulon, where I lived, Toulon as a village, as a town itself, wasn't a big metropole, and it was very much a summer town. Winters were horrible. So I was looking at, come to the end of my career, how I could potentially diversify my own financial portfolio. I'd made 1 or 2 property investments previously, that invested it with certain equity type stakes in terms of, shareholdings and investments, trying to move a bit of capital outside of South African shores, understanding the very high volatility which the South African economy currently rests in. This was sort of 5 years ago, so load shedding had already been around for about 9 years. So it really was about diversifying my portfolio. I then understood, yes, I was living in France. I probably made the mistake of not investing in overseas-based property in my first year or 2 in Toulon, given the fact that Toulon as a rugby club were paying my rent, or a big portion of that rent, and I could have potentially then invested in a very small thing which a third party could have been paying off. So a lot of regret, but also understanding that there was a idea to come back to South Africa, but the volatility therein, potentially had an opportunity where, in diversifying your portfolio in what, in my opinion, is a very stable asset class, the UK property market, has shown incredible growth over a very long period of time. And because not only of that growth, but the actual rand, pound, or sterling exchange rate component of it always being extremely competitive, your growth structure was almost double because of what the decreasing rand valuation was doing. So for me, it was understanding how you diversify your portfolio, what areas of asset class you look at. For me, it was property within the UK that was stable. I initially looked in London because, as a South African, not understanding the UK environment, that was sort of the first gamble. But then also seeing property prices in the UK, particularly in London, and knowing that it cost more for a 2-bedroom apartment in Wimbledon than what my 5-bedroom place in Cape Town costs, just didn't sit right with me. So it was brilliant to be able to, again, understand the opportunity of diversifying a portfolio, not only what it was like to try finance a property, but knowing that you could get an interest-only payment mortgage, which was brilliant. Particularly if you don't have immediate sum of disposable income that you can just spend on what is a very expensive diversification of asset class. So it was an interesting one, but an exciting one in wanting to diversify my portfolio.
And did you have friends who had bought property in the UK, or who did you use to help you find the right property?
So I did have friends that had bought property in the UK. A lot of South African rugby players have been plying their trade in various elements within France and the UK. And one of the guys that played with me at Toulon, had mentioned that he'd been in the UK for a number of years. He'd invested in 1 or 2 properties, and that his brother was helping him manage a few of them, but also trying to find in the mortgaging options, which is really great. So I didn't go in blind. I did have a little bit of help and assistance, but it was even in that help and assistance where I really needed to do a lot of internal research and understanding, making sure I knew what I was getting into. We have transfer duty in South Africa. What is the equivalent stamp duty in the UK?
Yeah.
So a lot of terms and consolidation understandings that I needed to get a grasp of. And yes, it was great having someone who could help and influence. But I mean, even for me, I'd sort of come to the end of my career in France. I didn't have a set job when I retired in 2018. And all of a sudden you go to, many of the big financial institutions within the UK. And because there's no confirmation of future income, the ability to get a mortgage was very tough, actually. And if I didn't have the one or two contacts that sort of got a private financial institution to actually fund that, because I didn't have any confirmed future income, it was a challenge initially, but because of the contacts, it made it a little bit easier.
It's one of those things that there's a lot of information, and especially when you're a South African living here in South Africa, the idea of buying a property for some people who have maybe never even been to the UK, it's a daunting prospect, which is why it's really important at our company to give as much information as possible and to be there for this whole process. So that's what we're trying to offer to people here in South Africa. So most people do think, let's buy in London because it's the capital city, but it is just so expensive, especially when you're converting from rands. So back then, when you first started investing in UK property, what was it, 5 years ago, you said, did you think of other areas that might be good for investment? Were you aware that northern cities, for example, like Manchester and Birmingham, are doing incredibly well? Had you considered those as options?
I didn't. I did, though, go with what I knew. So there's certain towns that I've been to from rugby perspective that I loved. And one of the considerations that I had as a top tier consideration, and I also want to say it was probably easier for me because I did have foreign currency. So I wasn't having to convert South African rands into pounds. I was maybe having to convert euros into pounds, but it was obviously, that was a lot easier than the rand pound. So honestly, I think I had an easier transition of being able to fund UK property, even though I couldn't even get I think the minimum or the maximum percentage I could get was a 60% mortgage. So obviously I had to put down 40% in terms of a deposit, which is a massive amount. But I did go with the areas that I knew of. And the one decision I took was that if myself and my family, if South Africa was to capitulate and, we had to leave, where could we see ourselves living? So that was one of the considerations that was an underlying factor of my decision. Should I need to leave South Africa, was I comfortable enough to go into this area where I was choosing a place to live in? And being South African, you obviously want a little bit of space. You don't want to be living on top of each other, which... But yeah, I'd looked at one or two others through my friends and the brokers that I'd been put in touch with. But the consideration was Manchester is great, Birmingham is great, and there's one or two other spots in and around the UK, particularly from a investment type opportunity that are, probably more fruitful. But I didn't look at the total investment because I knew, well, myself and my family potentially can't stay in a 2-bedroom, flat in Birmingham. So I needed a little bit of a garden. I needed a proper parking space. And that's why the decision I made, not just go to the likes of Wimbledon that were extremely expensive, or in London, but, somewhere a bit outside the city that's a little bit cheaper to live. Obviously a little bit more costly to sort of get in and out of London city, but the lifestyle that you then present isn't the city living. It's a little bit more homely in terms of being as close to South Africa as possible.
Bryan, the other question I was going to ask was, so for you then, with the investment properties in the UK, it was more than the mindset was a sort of safety net for family should anything go wrong within South Africa, but also a lot of clients that I'm speaking to want to get rands into a hard currency. So your intention, along with the safety net, was also to have sort of long-term wealth generation, was it?
It definitely was. Yeah. It was to protect capital. And I think, even if you invested in stocks or certain other financial environments, there's volatility in everything. We also saw sort of during the last 5-year period, property prices in the UK have fluctuated, gone up or down. But you've seen in Dubai, for instance, property prices have increased, I think, by 60% over the last year, which is ridiculous. I'm not sure I'd ever want to live in Dubai. And if apartment living in the UK is tough, I think Dubai is even tougher. So again, I think you need to be very comfortable with the knowledge that you have in whatever financial investment decision you make. For me, I wanted to diversify my portfolio. I didn't just want things in shares or stocks or in pension funds. I need to diversify that a little bit, and also know that, as much as you can have various other financial investments to then actually have a physical, tangible asset where you can go see it face to face, given what's happened at various levels of the financial environment over the last 20 years. So I think that was important for me, not wealth generation, but sort of being able to safeguard in a very stable asset class, which I think is really important for me. And then making sure that that asset class was on a growth trajectory, that it wasn't sort of declining in any way, and whether that was 8, 9, 12%, whatever that might be, but just understanding that there is definitely annualized growth. And one of the other considerations was the fact that, I couldn't potentially afford to be paying into a property. So, a interest-only repayment term was really important. And the UK was one of those markets where you could get an interest-only bond or mortgage. And that made a massive difference for me, knowing that I actually didn't have to overcompensate or overfund something because I was no longer earning the salary of a professional sports person.
Yeah, I think a lot of South Africans are not even aware they can get UK bonds, mortgages, and that they're interest only. So we're very lucky to be able to have that and leverage on our capital. And any sort of, when you started doing the property investments, were there any sort of watch outs that you thought, working with reputable companies or anything that was a concern at the time?
I think it was the knowledge base, having an understanding of the South African property market, having had a place there and a house that had been paid off. I've sort of been very much out of the actual buying of a house or property for a good part of a decade. So it was upskilling myself, understanding things, also having to be heavily reliant because I actually never visited the property before I bought it. So being able to have that trust relationship with a reputable person, trust is a very subjective term, but being able to, because I'd never gone to the property, so I had to believe in a lot of information that I didn't have physical capabilities of touching, which was really difficult. And over and above that, just consolidating all my other financial environments and understanding that this is potentially 20 to 30% of my wealth, and how you then financially plan for the future. So it's not an easy decision to be made. I think it becomes easier made when you have environments around you that you can trust are reliable, give you as much sound information as possible to make sure that the information on which you base your decision is as factual as possible. But then that also does require a lot of internal investigation and research to not go into anything blindly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to provide all the information so that you're totally transparent with people in what they're going into and all of the costs that are involved and the different taxes, the list goes on. But on the whole, have you been happy with the investment properties that you've got in the UK?
I've been very happy. I think there's been phenomenal growth, which I didn't expect. I mean, COVID, had a big impact on people's disposable income, and it did take a bit of a dip in terms of property prices. But I think as we sort of come out of what is a hectic, financial constraint of 3 years, there's a lot of positivity, in the investment. And, the best time to invest was 10 years ago. The next best time is now. So, very grateful that I got into that market 5 years ago now. And what that does, it just opens up more opportunity that if you were to go invest in, various other properties, you at least have a base, of something, particularly from a financial services environment. There's now a track record of positive repayment terms, there's a track record of your financial security. And that then allows, if you were to further invest or look at other investment opportunities, that there is a positive appetite to potentially then help you invest in a different way. So yeah, I'm very happy. Again, I think it was a decision of trying to diversify my portfolio with a stable, solid asset class that was showing okay growth. It's gone and done exceptional growth. And now if I was to sell the property, it would be a very worthwhile investment.
So you're definitely an advocate to South Africans for UK investment property then.
Yeah, I think, again, given the volatility of the rand, the ability to try to get money offshore, obviously there's the sort of limits of R1 million, up to 10 million rand now. That's, the new policy that's come in from the South African Revenue Service, which also needs to be taken into consideration. Where are you actually registered for tax? You don't buy it in a company or a trust and you buy it in your personal capacity, there's obviously tax implications for you as South African. So you really need to have people or information as sound as possible around you, because there are a lot of implications. But For me, diversifying my portfolio, having something that has grown phenomenally well over the last 5 years, but also knowing should push come to shove and we, for some other reason, had to leave South Africa out of no choice, there would be something there that's viable. And I think because we got into the market 5 years ago, it makes things a lot easier, should those hopefully never ever circumstances arise.